Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Another year is here, and if you live in California, you know what that means.
A tidal wave of new rules.
A tidal wave is right. Governor Gavin Newsom signed, 794 bills into law this past year alone.
And it's not just the sheer number, right? It's that many of the most transformative changes, the ones that are really going to impact your wallet, your daily routine, even your safety, they're often buried deep inside bills that don't make the national news.
Exactly. And that is our mission for you today. We took all the sources you sent us, and we've sifted through to find 5 new 2026 mandates that have sparked some really intense and often contradictory conversations.
Right.
We're going to unpack the details, look at what the legislature intended to do, and then really examine the unintended consequences the material brings up.
And we have a huge range today. We're talking about environmental attempts that might just backfire, new housing regulations that could raise your rent, some very high stakes social policy, federal showdowns.
And even a surprisingly controversial mandate about, of all things, what goes into your dinner.
It's a perfect snapshot of that tension in modern governance. Best intentions meeting a very messy reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. And let's start with a classic California battleground: plastic.
The plastic bag.
Still trying to get rid of it. So Senate Bill 10L53 is officially taking effect, and this seems to be the absolute definitive ban. Plastic bags, even the thicker ones, are completely gone from grocery stores.
And they have to be replaced with paper.
Right, and that mandatory 10-cent charge per bag.
Still there, that remains. This law is really a direct admission from the legislature that their first big attempt just failed.
You mean back in 2014?
Exactly. Back in 2014, when they banned single-use plastic, stores just switched to those much thicker, reusable plastic bags.
Oh, I remember those. They were everywhere. And let's be honest, everyone still threw them out.
Right. You ended up with a massive pile of slightly sturdier plastic that still felt like waste. And that's the loophole. SB 1053 is explicitly designed to close. They're tricked to force true reusability.
But the way they're doing it, by mandating paper, that's where the sources you found get really critical.
That's where the real controversy lies.
It's funny, the analysis pointed out this weird consumer attachment people had to those thicker plastic bags. People actually liked them because they were robust enough to repurpose.
Sure, for lining small trash cans or storage or travel.
Yeah, that practical secondary use is just gone now.
And that's the personal inconvenience, but the contradiction gets really jarring when you look at the environmental science. A life cycle study cited by critics shows that moving exclusively to paper bags could actually increase the overall environmental burden.
Wait, how? That seems completely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
How can paper possibly be worse than plastic?
It all comes down to manufacturing and logistics. Paper bags, well, they require significantly more energy, way more water, and they create higher transportation emissions to produce compared to plastic.
Is they're heavier?
Heavier and bulkier, so fewer can fit on a truck, which increases the carbon footprint of delivery, especially in a state as huge as California.
So if I'm getting this study right, a single paper bag has to be reused multiple times just to break even, environmentally, with one of the old plastic ones.
That's precisely it. You're basically trading one environmental problem for a potentially larger, less visible one.
Which is the exact conclusion the critics came to. They suggest this law is marginal at best in terms of real environmental gains. It's more about optics.
And they argue that if the goal is truly massive waste reduction, the legislature should be focusing its attention elsewhere.
Not the checkout bag.
Not the checkout bag, more like the heavy, non-recyclable plastic wrapping you find on, prepackaged meat, produce, all the bulk items inside the store.
Which are a much bigger contributor to the waste stream.
Exactly. So the accusation here is that banning the checkout bag is a very visible, kind of feel-good move, but it completely sidesteps the harder, less visible reforms that would actually deliver substantial change.
A legislative move that looks environmental on paper, but maybe not so much in practice. Okay, let's connect that idea, high-cost regulation, to another area where costs are out of control: housing.
A classic California dilemma. You try to solve a problem with a regulation that ends up hitting people's pocketbooks.
Speaking of hitting pocketbooks, let's talk about Assembly Bill 628. This law is making waves because it mandates that all rental units must now include a working refrigerator and stove as part of the legal definition of habitable conditions.
And this is a really significant shift in that legal definition. For decades, habitable conditions focused on the absolute basics of safe shelter.
Things like structural integrity, working plumbing, heat.
Right, protection from pests. It was about preventing genuinely substandard housing. This bill drastically expands that scope to mandate specific major appliances.
So it changes the legal idea of shelter from just a safe structure to more of a provisioned living space.
Yes, and while the intent is understandable, I mean, everyone should have a way to cook and store food safely, the critique from property groups in the sources raises a very sharp economic objection.
Which is that this cost doesn't just disappear,
Mm.
right? The core argument the critics make is that if you impose new non-negotiable costs on landlords for buying and maintaining these appliances.
That cost is inevitably pushed directly onto the tenant through increased rent.
Of course.
Lawmakers might assume the burden gets absorbed by the owners, but in a high-demand market like California, new operating costs just get factored into the price.
So if the goal is making housing more affordable, adding new mandatory costs to each unit seems to work directly against that. So it feels like they're treating a symptom instead of the cause.
Exactly. And the future question this bill raises is pretty provocative. Where does this legal expansion of entitlement actually stop if a stove and a fridge are no necessities that have to be provided?
The sources brought up the slippery slope argument. Are microwaves next? Dishwashers, in-unit laundry.
Precisely. Right now, those are seen as amenities, things that justify a higher price in the rental market. But once the legislature sets a precedent of mandating specific appliances, critics fear that line between a basic right and an expensive amenity starts to get very blurry, very fast.
So the law addresses a missing fridge, but not the state's massive housing crisis.
That's the argument.
It's a difficult discussion about who pays for what and how we even define necessity.
Okay, let's shift gears now to legislation that is maybe the most historically and politically charged of the bunch. Senate Bill 518.
Right. This one establishes the Bureau for Descendants of American Slavery as a permanent state agency.
This is a monumental step. It's basically the foundational piece for implementing reparations in the state, isn't it?
It is. The agency is being tasked with tackling incredibly complex issues that need a huge infrastructure.
And what does this bureau actually do? What are its main functions? It's setting up the operational structure. The reports say its main focus areas are creating divisions to handle genealogy and lineage tracking, figuring out who qualifies, and also managing property reclamation issues and building educational frameworks.
So it's building the state-level apparatus for the eventual distribution of reparations.
That's the goal.
The stated intent from supporters is clearly ambitious, looking to correct deep historical harms. The source material had a pretty powerful quote from the chair of the California Legislative Black Caucus.
Yes, the chair was quoted saying, quote, "For generations, Black Americans have faced exclusion, exploitation, and systemic barriers to opportunity. With SB 518, we lay the foundation for a future built on truth, equity, and repair." End quote.
That really captures the legislative commitment there. But the sources also provided a very sharp counter-narrative, focusing less on the goal and more on the method.
That's the ideological fault line. Critics see the law as being built on a narrative of, quote, universal guilt. They argue it tries to hold current residents accountable for past injustices that happened, before they were even born.
And the core of that opposition seems to be about the act of identity classification itself, right?
Absolutely. The critical argument is that, regardless of the goal, basing an entire state agency and the distribution of resources solely on racial ancestry dividing people by genealogy to assign benefit or perceived debt is, in itself, a form of discrimination in a modern context.
So they argue that creating a race-based government bureaucracy risks deepening divides rather than bridging them.
That's the fear.
So the law is praised for its intent to create repair, but condemned by critics for its method. It's a huge question. Can you address historical discrimination by creating new racial classifications today without introducing new problems?
It's a really interesting case study in how you approach systemic reform.
A fascinating and difficult conversation. Okay, let's move now to a collision of authority, specifically between California state mandates and federal agents,
Yes, Senate Bill 627.
which has been nicknamed the No Secret Police in California bill. This law prohibits law enforcement from wearing masks while interacting with the public, and it's aimed squarely at federal ICE agents.
Right, and for anyone who doesn't know, ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're federal officers. The context here is hyper-political because it steps right into that rift between California and Washington, D.C. on immigration.
And the source material explains why the agents are wearing masks. It's not for the sake of anonymity.
No, not at all. They report wearing masks because they genuinely fear for their safety. The officers cite real threats, increasing violence, and coordinated doxing
Or
attempts.
their personal information is just published online.
Exactly. So they see the mask as a basic safety measure to prevent their families from being targeted.
The data on this from the Department of Homeland Security it's staggering. The sources show an over 1,000% increase in violence against ICE agents compared to the previous administration.
1,000%. It's a shocking jump in a very short amount of time. And the analysis, it doesn't pull any punches on the perceived cause. It attributes that spike directly to rhetoric from some political leaders comparing ICE to groups like the Nazis or the Gestapo.
So the argument is that this rhetoric isn't just political posturing, it's driving real, measurable violence against these agents. And the sources also point out that ICE is often removing serious criminals.
That's a key detail that gets lost. These agents often deal with highly dangerous individuals, including members of transnational gangs like Trenda, who are known to actively target law enforcement.
So stripping away an officer's ability to protect their identity is seen by critics as dramatically increasing their personal risk. But what about the legal grounds? Can California actually tell federal agents how to operate?
And that's the central legal challenge. The critics claim this bill is essentially unenforceable, that it's largely symbolic,
Why?
because of the U.S. Constitution's Supremacy Clause. This doctrine basically dictates that states cannot legally pass laws that attempt to regulate federal agencies or how federal authorities operate. Federal law trumps state law.
So we have a law that legal critics say is constitutionally invalid, yet it actively increases the reported risk for federal agents who are already facing a 1,000% spike in attacks.
It's a huge consequence for what many sources are calling pure political theater.
We save perhaps the most unique law for last. Let's shift gears one more time to nutritional policy with Assembly Bill 1830. This law mandates that corn tortillas and masa products sold in California must now contain folic acid.
This one is truly unusual. It's a public health intervention targeting a very specific food staple. The legislature's justification is rooted in demographic statistics.
Right, because folic acid is crucial for preventing certain birth defects. What disparity did they find?
They observed that only 28% of Hispanic pregnant women reported taking folic acid supplements, compared to 46% of white women. And that disparity suggested a higher statistical risk for birth defects in the Hispanic community.
So the state's solution was to essentially force the vitamin directly into a food that's stereotypically associated with the Latino community.
And that is the absolute core of the criticism in the sources. Critics argue that instead of, funding nutrition education or making supplements more accessible or just empowering people to make informed choices with their doctors, the state chose what one source called the laziest option.
And another label, the approach itself, patronizing and stereotypical.
Right. And beyond the optics and the cultural criticism, there are some serious health implications here that the sources highlight. This is not a one-size-fits-all medical issue.
You mean that not everyone processes synthetic folic acid the same way?
Exactly. A significant portion of the population has a gene mutation that makes it very difficult for their bodies to process synthetic folic acid. These people actually need the vitamin in a different, already processed form called folate.
That is a crucial medical nuance.
Yeah.
So by mandating synthetic folic acid for everyone, regardless of pregnancy status, genetics, or personal tolerance, the state is creating a risk of side effects for people who can't process it.
It creates a situation where a public health measure for one group might cause unintended side effects for another. Ideally, the decision about supplementation happens between a person and their doctor based on genetics, not through a mandate targeting the food supply.
And this brings us back to that broader principle we've seen in a few of these mandates.
Yeah.
How comfortable should the state be with mandating what universally goes into our food, overriding personal health decisions?
It forces a hard look at whether the means justify the ends when it comes to mass intervention.
What a dense stack of legislation. When you step back and look at these 5 bills, and they're just a tiny fraction of the 794 that passed, the takeaway is clear.
There's a huge gap between what lawmakers intend and the complicated reality of what actually happens.
Right. We saw environmental laws that could result in a higher carbon footprint, housing mandates that could raise rents, a push for social repair that critics say enshrines discrimination,
and a law for agent accountability that may actually increase the danger to federal agents. The consequences are rarely simple, which is why digging into the source material is so crucial.
So this brings us to a final, larger question for you to consider as you think about all this. Let's go back to that folic acid issue.
When the government identifies a statistical health disparity in a specific demographic group, how far can or should it go to mandate action through these ubiquitous interventions, like adding supplements to food?
Before that intervention starts to infringe on the basic right to informed personal choice and potentially causes unintended side effects to other people. That is a fundamental dilemma far larger than just tortillas or paper bags. We hope this deep dive gave you a clear understanding of the complexity here. Stay informed and let us know which of these laws you found most surprising. We'll be back next time to dive into a new stack of sources.